Chickens are food. Everyone knows what a chicken is for, and nobody has ever needed it explained to them. Then you look at a pit dug in Hampshire around 300 BC and find a cockerel lying in the ground, whole, every bone still in its place, not one cut mark anywhere on the skeleton. Nobody ate that bird. Somebody carried it to the hole, set it down, and covered it over. That distinction matters more than it sounds. Food waste has a shape, and archaeologists know it on sight. Bone that is broken, scattered, gnawed by dogs, cracked open for marrow mixed in with the ash in the shells and the general debris of a kitchen. An articulated skeleton is the opposite of that. An articulated skeleton means the animal was never taken apart. The chicken arrived in Europe late. It spread slowly. And for centuries, in large parts of the continent, it was kept, painted onto coins, watched, consulted, and buried, but only rarely killed for the pot. Working out why means working out what the chicken actually was before it turned into the most numerous bird on the planet. That story starts in a rice field, and the bird in it looks almost nothing like the one in your fridge. The ancestor is the red junglefowl, a bird still living across the forests of South and Southeast Asia. It is small. A wild male weighs somewhere around a kilogram, most of that feather, frame, and leg. It flies well enough to roost in trees, and it is nervous in the way forest birds are nervous, which is to say, it spends its life within one panicked second of being somewhere else. Consider what that animal offers a hungry person. Not much meat. The meat it has is dark, dense, working muscle, rather than the pale breast you are picturing. It lays eggs in 1 or 2 clutches a year, seasonally, roughly a dozen in total, and the precise figure varies by population and by who is counting. So treat that number as an estimate rather than a measurement. A modern laying hen produces something close to 300 a year. The gap between those two birds is not a small improvement. It is the entire history of the relationship. So the obvious question sits there from the start. If the wild bird is a poor meat animal and an indifferent egg producer, why would anyone go to the trouble of keeping it? The answer that currently holds is that nobody went to the trouble. The bird came to us. In 2022, a large international team led by Joris Peters published a reassessment of chicken remains from around 600 archaeological sites across 89 countries. That is not a new excavation, it is something arguably more useful. A systematic audit of what everybody already thought they knew. Bird bones are thin, brittle, and easily shifted downward through soft ground, which means a chicken bone can end up sitting in a layer far older than the bird ever was. Many of the famous early claims turned out to rest on exactly that problem. The supposed chickens of the Indus cities, the very early Chinese finds, several of the celebrated Near Eastern examples, re-examined, directly radiocarbon dated where possible, and in case after case, withdrawn. What survived the audit is a much younger and much tighter picture. The oldest bones the team accepts as unambiguously domestic come from Ban Non Wat, a settlement in northeast Thailand dated to somewhere between about 1650 and 1250 BC. More than 95% of the bird bone at that site belongs to Gallus, which is a strange thing to find in a landscape teeming with other birds, and a large share of it comes from juveniles. And here's the part that reframes everything. Ban Non Wat was a dry rice farming settlement. Dry rice is grown on upland soil watered by seasonal rain rather than in flooded paddies. It produces a landscape that a junglefowl finds close to irresistible. Open ground, exposed grain, a reliable seasonal glut of exactly the food the bird is built to eat. Peters and his colleagues argue that cereal cultivation acted as the catalyst. The farmers did not hunt these birds into captivity. They grew a crop. The birds walked in from the forest edge, and over generations, the ones least frightened of people did best. That is a familiar pattern in domestication, and it usually goes by an unlovely name, the commensal pathway. The animal domesticates itself more or less by moving in. Picture the sight at first light. The rain has finished for the season, and the upland plots are standing in cut stubble, grain spilled and trampled across the ground where the harvest was worked. The forest edge is maybe 200 paces off. As the light comes up, the birds come with it in ones and twos, moving in that stop, start, way junglefowl move. Head up, head down, head up. A dog notices and does not bother. The birds are close enough that a child could throw something at them, and far enough that throwing something would be pointless. Nobody is farming these animals. Nobody has decided anything. There's just grain on the ground and a bird that wants it. In a few hundred years in which that arrangement slowly stops being an accident. I should be honest about where the ground is soft here. Not everyone accepts that the Ban Non Wat birds were domestic. The paper itself flags the status as unresolved, and a separate genetic study published the same year reads the origins differently. The argument for domestication rests on circumstance rather than proof. The sheer dominance of one species in the bird bone, the high proportion of young birds, the fact that they were placed in human graves alongside dogs and pigs and cattle that certainly were domestic. Taken together, I find that convincing, but convincing is not the same as settled. And anyone who tells you the chicken's origin is a closed question is ahead of the evidence. What happens next is better documented, and it is where the paradox gets sharp. The bird starts moving west, and it moves as cargo, mostly by sea, in the hands of traders. A companion study published alongside the Peters paper, led by Julia Best, tracked that dispersal through direct radiocarbon dating of 23 of the earliest claimed chickens across Western Eurasia and Northwest Africa. That is a small number, and it is worth understanding why so few. Directly dating a bone destroys part of it. Museums are protective of their earliest specimens, and bird bone is fragile enough that a lot of candidates simply do not survive the process. So the team dated the ones that mattered most, the birds whose supposed early dates were holding the whole chronology up. The result was the same kind of correction. Things that had been placed centuries early came back much later. Chickens appear in the Mediterranean world by roughly 800 BC. They reach the cold north of Europe, Scotland, Scandinavia, Iceland, something like 1,000 years after that. Sea routes did most of the work, and that is not incidental. A chicken is a good ship animal. In a way, a cow is not. It is small. It feeds on the same grain the crew is already carrying. It needs almost no water compared with a mammal of any size, and a handful of birds fits in a basket. The bird spread along the coastlines and the trade routes rather than across the interiors, which is exactly why it took another 1,000 years to reach places that were, by land, barely any further away. A slow spread is not by itself remarkable. What the ground says about those first European birds is, wherever the chicken arrives in Europe, it arrives as something other than dinner. In Britain, the earliest chickens turn up in the Iron Age, and they turn up in a form that food does not take. Whole birds, individual burials, carefully placed, unbutchered. Houghton, down in Hampshire, is the example the specialists reach for, and it is not alone. The same pattern shows up in northern France. The bird also shows up on late Iron Age coinage in southern Britain and across the Channel, which is not a place ordinary livestock generally appears, coins being objects of power rather than inventory. Then there is a written source, and it is an unusually blunt one. Julius Caesar, in his account of the Gallic Wars, records that the Britons considered it against divine law to eat hare, fowl, or goose, and that they kept these animals anyway for pleasure and amusement. I went looking for an early European site where the first chickens show up plainly as kitchen refuse, and I could not find one that the specialists agree on. That absence is the evidence. Now, Caesar is a Roman general writing about a people he was invading, and Roman writers were not above making the neighbors sound exotic. The first time I read that passage, I assumed it was the usual condescension dressed up as ethnography. What changes the reading is that the bones agree with him. The archaeologist Naomi Sykes and her colleagues, working on where Britain's Easter symbols actually come from, radiocarbon dated chicken and hair remains from British sites, and found the same thing the excavation reports had been quietly recording for decades. Complete skeletons buried with care, no butchery. Their phrase for it was that these animals were too special to eat. So picture the other end of that. A settlement on the Hampshire chalk, a few centuries before the Romans come. The ground here is thin soil over rock, and it is full of pits, dug originally to store grain, and then filled back in with whatever the community decided belonged in them. The bird is carried across in someone's hands, alive or newly dead, and it is not plucked, it is not opened. Nobody reaches for a knife at any point. It goes into the pit intact, legs folded, and the chalk goes back over it. 2,300 years later, somebody lifts it out with a trowel and a brush, and the whole skeleton comes up still connected, which is how anyone knows. Bones that stay articulated were never disturbed. Bones that were dinner never stay articulated. Which raises the obvious follow-up, special how? The most likely answer is the least mystical one. The chicken was foreign. It came from somewhere at the edge of the known world, carried by traders who had themselves come a long way. And in a great many cultures, things that arrive from the outer edges get treated as though they carry something of that distance with them. A rooster is also, frankly, a spectacular object. It is loud, it is aggressive, it is colored like nothing else in a northern European farmyard, and it announces the sunrise with total confidence every single morning. If you were assembling a bird to be regarded as significant, you would build that one. There is a Roman consul later in this story who threw a cage of them into the sea, and it cost him a fleet. Before that, the concession this story needs. The picture I have just drawn is a European one, and it does not hold everywhere. In southern Central Asia, along the routes that later became the Silk Road, a study published in 2024 found chickens being raised for egg production from the 4th century BC onward across a dozen sites and a millennium and a half. Egg production is not ritual. That is a working animal, kept for output, in exactly the period when British communities were burying single birds intact. 2 regions, 1 species, completely different relationships. Anyone who tells you the ancient world treated the chicken one way is flattening something that was never uniform. But in the Mediterranean and in Rome above all, the bird kept its strange job for a long time. Roman public life ran on augury, the reading of divine approval from the behavior of birds, and the state kept sacred chickens for the purpose. They traveled with the army in cages under the care of a specialist called a pularius. Before a significant decision, and particularly before a battle, the pularius would open the cage and offer grain. If the birds fell on it so greedily that food dropped from their beaks, the sign was as good as signs got. If they ate reluctantly or refused, the gods were saying no. In 249 BC, during the First War against Carthage, the consul Publius Claudius Pulcher planned a surprise attack on the harbor at Drepana, off the Sicilian coast. Before dawn, he had the chickens consulted. Imagine the deck. The fleet is loaded and quiet, the harbor is a few hours away, and the entire operation depends on arriving before anyone ashore is awake. The pularius brings up the cage, scatters the grain, and the birds will not touch it. So the timetable now belongs to a cage of poultry. Pulcher, according to the Roman writers who tell the story afterwards, said that if they would not eat, they could drink, and had them thrown overboard. He lost the battle catastrophically. Ancient sources put the losses at 93 ships out of 123 and tens of thousands of men. He was prosecuted at Rome and died soon after, and the episode became the standard Roman parable about contempt for ritual. Strip the theology out of it and look at what remains. A Roman fleet, a Roman consul, a Roman military decision, and a cage of birds with enough standing to stop the whole thing. Nobody was going to eat those chickens. Rome is also where the job changes. By the 1st century AD, the agricultural writer Columella was devoting an entire book of his farming manual to poultry. How to house them, what to feed them, which breeds to keep, how to manage laying. That is not a text about a sacred animal. That is a text about a production system. And in the archaeology of Roman Britain, the chicken finally starts appearing the way you would expect food to appear. At Fishbourne, the great Roman palace on the Sussex coast, chicken bone turns up as ordinary refuse, butchered, broken, discarded. In under 2 centuries, the bird moves from a grave to a rubbish heap. What made the difference was not a change of heart, it was numbers. As chicken populations grew, the bird stopped being rare. And once it stopped being rare, it stopped being special. And once it stopped being special, there was nothing left to stop anyone eating it. The reverence was never really about the chicken, it was about scarcity. And scarcity is a condition, not a virtue. The proof of that runs in reverse, too. When Roman administration withdrew from Britain in the early 5th century AD, chicken populations in the province collapsed. The infrastructure that had made them common went away, and so did they. So the twist is this. For roughly 1,000 years, the chicken traveled the world as a bird nobody would eat. And the single reason it eventually became food is that there were finally enough of them for eating to feel unremarkable. The bird did not earn its way onto the plate by being good to eat. It got there by becoming ordinary. Everything we now think of as the chicken's whole purpose. The meat, the eggs, the price is a consequence of that. And all of it was engineered afterwards. Look at how far that engineering has run. Selective breeding has changed the animal beyond recognition. The yellow skin of most commercial birds does not even come from the red junglefowl. Genetic work published in 2008 traced it to the gray junglefowl, a different species altogether. Body size roughly doubled between the medieval period and the modern era, then increased up to 5-fold again in the second half of the 20th century alone. Most of that last jump has a startlingly specific origin. In the late 1940s, the American poultry industry ran a national breeding competition, judged on which birds put on the most meat fastest on the least feed. Entrants shipped hatching eggs to be raised under identical conditions and scored. The winning lines were crossed into commercial stock, and the modern broiler is essentially their descendant. A meat bird that took around 16 weeks to reach market in the 1920s reaches a heavier weight in under half that time now. Growth rate roughly tripled inside a single human lifetime, and it did so because a small number of people sat down and decided which chickens would exist. A broiler today reaches slaughter weight in 5 to 7 weeks. Its wild ancestor lives for years. In 2018, a team led by Karis Bennett argued in the Royal Society's journal that this bird should be treated as a geological marker. Their reasoning is hard to dismiss. The standing population of broiler chickens at the time of that study was around 23 billion, which is more than every other bird species on Earth combined by mass, and the skeletons are distinctive enough in shape, chemistry, and pathology that a future geologist digging into a 21st century landfill would find a species that exists nowhere in the earlier record. The bird is now unable to survive without us. Its bones are a layer. 2,500 years ago, a community in Hampshire dug a hole for a single cockerel and laid it in unbroken because killing it for meat was unthinkable. We now produce and consume tens of billions a year, and the bones go into the ground in quantities that will still be legible when everything else about this century has eroded. The same animal, the same species, in the same relationship with the same people. Only the number changed.